Hey, and welcome back to another video. So I'm back. I've got my voice back. I've recovered from COVID. I appreciate all the nice messages. But in today's video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at how we can basically like leverage and use stacks in SwiftUI. So what we're going to do is we're going to build this component, as you can see here. So you may have saw something similar to this in iOS 15, and we're just going to basically build like a forecast view, so you can basically view your forecasts over a period of time. I basically just got a new Xcode project set up here. So if we actually look at our simulator to basically see what it is that we're going to be building, you can see that we actually have these times and the weather and the temperature. So what we actually need to do is we actually need to basically like model this data. Now I'm not actually going to be using an API for this to keep it, simple. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically create a struct and just basically almost fake this data. So in our project, let's create a new struct essentially to actually handle this forecast reading. So we'll actually call it forecast reading. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new group. I'm just going to call it model. And then within this group, I'm going to create the struct and write it out. So let's just break this down. So we basically got our struct here with three properties. So the first one we have is time. So this time property is going to basically represent the string time at the top here. Now I know you could use a date for this and actually, apply a format. And to be honest with you, it probably would be better to use a date if you're actually working on an API. But because we're just simply just going to model this data and just so we can basically speed up development, I'm just going to do it as a string. Then we have symbol, which is going to be a string. So symbol here basically represents the icon that you can see here. So we're going to be using SF symbols. And then finally, we have temperature, which is going to be a double. And this temperature is going to represent the temperature that you see at the bottom here. All right, cool. All right, cool. So now that we've actually built this out, what we're going to do is we're going to basically build an extension on this to basically hold our static data that we're going to use to basically fake the API response. So I'm just going to type this out. All right, cool. So let's just look at this now. So we basically got a static constant. So why did I use a static constant and not a computed property? Well, essentially, we don't really need this to reevaluate and calculate itself every single time. This is going to hold some dummy data, so we don't need it to be a computed property. So if you actually look at the array, essentially you can see here why I use a string, so I can just quickly add in some times. And these symbols that we will be using, so these symbols are actually part of the weather SF symbol. So if you just go to the SF symbols app on your Mac, you'll actually see a list of all the possible weather icons you can use. So we're simply just using the ones from the weather category. And the next thing that we're going to be doing is we're basically setting the temperature, as you can see here. So now that we've got our model set up for our forecast readings, what we actually need to do now is actually look and actually discuss and break down how stacks work in SwiftUI. So this is the component, as you can see here. So this is what we're going to be building. And what I want to do is I want to basically discuss how we can actually tackle building this component and actually breaking it down into smaller components and how stacks can allow us to easily do that as well. So as you can see here, we've obviously got our list of times. So how would we actually basically, break this down? Well, what we need to do first is we actually need to basically build the first component in this list. And as you can see, like I've highlighted in red, this is the first component that we're going to basically build. So when we actually look at this deeper, what actually does our forecast view need? So let's actually look and think about the components I actually need. So we've obviously got a label at the top that basically gives us a time. So it can either be now or 8 o'clock or 10 a.m. And to basically represent this, it would actually make sense to use something like a text. So using a text component in SwiftUI would help us represent the time. And the next thing that we basically got is we basically got a symbol. So we've got an icon on the screen that we actually need to represent from the SF symbols. So what could we use to basically, represent it? So we can actually use an image to basically represent this. And finally, at the bottom, we basically have the temperature. So as you can see, we basically got our degrees here. And if you're American, that's Fahrenheit. But essentially, what we can use to represent this is a text. Now, we basically got all these views here laid out. And how do we actually get them to all lay out vertically? Well, in order to do that, we can basically use something called a VStack. So what is a VStack? So basically, a VStack is a component in SwiftUI that basically allows you to basically lay out views vertically, as you can see in the graphic here. So alternatively to VStack, you also have something called a HStack. So a HStack is basically the opposite. You can basically lay out views horizontally within SwiftUI. So these two components are really, really useful whenever you need to basically group and lay out components without needing a list. If you just need to just basically whip out something quickly when you need to align stuff horizontally or align stuff vertically as well. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to look at how we can actually leverage using both of these components. And the first one we're going to look at is how we can use the VStack to basically build our forecast view. So let's do that now. So we're back in the project now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new group called views. And within this folder called views, we're going to create a new SwiftUI view called forecast view. All right, cool. And like I said previously in the presentation, the whole point of this view essentially is to basically build out this part of the component here. So we just want to basically build out this bit of the component here. So the first thing we're going to do in order to do that is we're going to basically pass in a forecast reading into this view so we can basically pull out the data from our model. All right, cool. And we should get an error in our preview saying that we're missing forecast reading, which is fine. So what we're going to do is we're just going to access the array of dummy data that we have and just inject the first one. So, cool. So now what we need to do, we actually now need to start actually building out our views. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add in a VStack, because if you look at our design, it actually goes down vertically. So we don't want it to be horizontal. So let's add in a VStack into our body. I'm just going to just embed this text in a VStack. So in order to do that, you can just hold Command on your keyboard and then click on it. And then you'll see an option here called Embed in VStack. And now our view is in a VStack. You can't actually visibly see it, but it is in a VStack. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add in some views to basically see how the VStack lays out these views. So I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. So you can see that we've basically got this now. So let's just zoom in a bit more so you can see it clearer. All right, sweet. A bit more. All right, cool. So you can see this now. So what we've basically done is we've basically got a text, as you can see here. So that's pulling out the time from our model. And we've basically got the SF symbol that we're going to be using here. Now, you'll see this property that I've used here called rendering mode. So what does this rendering mode actually do? So essentially, this rendering mode allows you to basically use the default color that it comes with in SF symbols for the icon. So think about it like a colored icon, or alternatively, you can basically have it as a base color, so you can basically apply like tints on it. So I just want to use the original rendering mode for this image, so it just adds in the color format. And then finally we basically have the temperature, as you can see at the bottom here, with some font styling as well. All right, cool. So as you can see, we've got them all laid out, but as you can see, it's quite tight to each other. Like there's not that much spacing between them, which is an issue. So how can we actually add space in between these elements? So the first thing I want to do is actually just go switch now to the Apple documentation for VStacks. So let's do that now. And as you can see, when we actually look at the documentation for a VStack, you can see here that we actually have properties in the initializer that allow us to basically customize the way our VStack looks. So the first thing you can see here is we've got alignment and leading. So we can actually specify if we want our content, if it was like to span the whole screen. Do we want the content within it to be in the center? Do we want it to be leading or trailing? So by default, this property is center. And we also have this property here called spacing as well. So this allows us to basically define the spacing between each one of our items. So you can see in the example here that basically there's been a spacing of 10 points basically specified between each item in the list, as you can see below here. And then finally, as you can see, I just want to basically just quickly talk about this property here called content, because you might be wondering what is that. So essentially, this content is basically a closure that's basically using a view builder to basically, allow you to basically specify the views that you want your VStack to contain. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go back to our project, and we're actually going to use the spacing property to define the spacing between each one of our views. So I'm just going to basically specify the spacing here like so. And now you can see the spacing that we've applied to our view. All right, cool. So now if you actually look at our actual, simulator, you can see that the text here is actually white. So what we need to do is we actually need to actually make the text in here white. So in order to do that, on our VStack, we're going to basically give it a modifier so all its children can basically get the same style. So in our case, it's going to be this style is going to basically apply onto our text only, and it won't apply into our image because we specified we want the rendering mode to be the original SF symbol. So let's do that now. All right, cool. And as you can see, because we made the text white and we've got a white background, you cannot see the text anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to change our preview a bit, and we're going to make it look more like the component. So in our preview, let's just do that now. Cool. So as you can see now in our preview, well, you can't see because it's really small, but if I zoom in, as you can see now, we've actually got our preview and it actually looks more like what we're trying to aim for. So let's just go back to the simulator, and as you can see here, we've got a list that's like horizontal. So how are we going to tackle doing this? Well, essentially what we could do is we actually could use a HStack to basically, handle this layout. But I don't really want to use a HStack, and the reason why is because HStacks don't really handle reuse very well. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some LazyStacks and how we can leverage them to basically build out lists when we need them. So let's look into that now. So like I mentioned before, we have a list of forecasts in our view. And what we could do is we actually could use something like this, as you see on the screen here, basically, build out that list using a HStack within a scroll view, and we just basically loop through all the items and just draw them on the screen. But that wouldn't be very performant, and why is that? So let's say if we had a list of views where it had like 30, 50, maybe even 100 items, having to draw every single one of those views can be quite, intense on the system. So the problem that we've also got there is that when we actually draw views on the screen, they're actually not being removed when they're not needed anymore. Because if you actually scroll through a list of 50 items and you're on item 20, you don't really need the first item anymore because you're not really looking at it. So in order to actually tackle this, there's actually something in SwiftUI called the LazyStacks. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to look and break that down in the next slide, what LazyStacks are and how they work with reuse. So let's just look at this example here. So we basically got a stack here. So this is going to represent a LazyVStack. And what's basically happening, as you can see here, is when you're actually on the cells that are visible, which are being represented by the group in the green box, that's actually what's drawn on the screen. And as you can see on the left and right hand side, we actually have some blocks that are actually grayed out. Essentially, what this means is that these views are not visible on the screen anymore, so the system releases them. So essentially what's happening with our LazyStack is they're being removed from the system when we don't need them anymore. And the reason why this is beneficial is because, going back to my example before, if you had a list of like 30, 50, or 100 items, we only show the user what they need, and any cells that are not present on the screen basically just get disposed of. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to look at how we can use a LazyHStack in our case, because obviously we want our views to be laid out horizontally, not vertically. So we're going to use a LazyHStack to basically lay out our forecast views and basically help us, handle our subset data. So let's do that now. So let's go back into our views and let's create a new SwiftUI file. What we're going to call this is we're going to call this forecast list view. And like we said before, we're basically going to be using a LazyStack to basically lay out this view. So when you're working with LazyStacks, you actually need to embed them in a scroll view. If you don't do this, it basically means that you will not be able to actually scroll the LazyStack either vertically or horizontally. Now, by default, scroll views actually do scroll vertically, so downwards. So what we need to do is specify a scroll view with a horizontal scroll. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see, we've specified our scroll view and we basically said that we want it to be horizontal. So the next thing we need to do is actually add in our lazy HStack, because the reason why we're using HStack, remember, is because we want our views to lay out horizontally. So let's type this out. All right, cool. And what we basically said here, we basically have our HStack with our alignment to the top, and we basically have a spacing of 16. So you can see that here now. So because we've actually done this, what we need to do now is we actually need to use a for each to basically loop through our forecast, so we can actually lay out our forecast view in the view you can see here. So when you're using a for each, there's two ways of doing it. So the first way is basically using a identifiable object. Now, if you look at our struct that we specified for forecast reading, if I just go to our model, we actually don't subclass identifiable. So what we need to do is we need to basically give the for each a identifier or a property it can use to uniquely identify each object. And in order to do that, we're going to basically use the time. So let's do that now. So as you can see here, we're basically saying that we want to loop through our dummy data, and to uniquely identify each object in our collection, we're going to basically use the time property, and we're going to basically access the forecast that we basically loop through in that array. So the last thing we need to do now is actually add in our forecast view and inject the forecast into it. So let's do that now. So as you can see, well, you can't see because the text is white, but you can see here it's being highlighted in the previews with the outline that we basically got all our forecasts on the screen. So in order for us to see this, what we're going to do is we're basically just going to basically give our preview some modifiers so you can actually see this on the screen now. So let's do that. All right, cool. And you can see now, if we just go to the preview, that we can actually scroll through all of these items horizontally because we specified that with our scroll view. But if you actually look at this here, you'll notice that the actual temperature has a dot symbol and obviously the zero because it's a double. Now, this doesn't really match up with what we have on the simulator. We actually just have the degree symbol. So what we need to do is we actually need to go into our forecast view and actually give it a formatter so we can actually format it to look like this. So let's do that now. So if we just go into our forecast view, what we're going to do is we're going to write a function that basically formats this into degrees, and it's going to be private so we can't expose it. So underneath the body, we're just going to say, right, cool. So we basically got our function signature here where we're going to pass in the temperature, and we're just basically going to format it. So what we're going to do now is do some typing, and then I'm going to break it down. So what we basically got here is we basically got a management formatter here, and we basically specify the unit options that is going to temperature without the unit. So what does this mean? So essentially what this means is that we're going to basically get our temperature without the Celsius or the Fahrenheit. So it's just going to basically be the degree symbol like so. And then what we do is we basically create a measurement where we basically get the temperature, format it. So we're going to use the Celsius in our case. And then we're going to format the string using the measurement object. So what we need to do now is actually use this format function on our actual temperature. So what we're going to do is just delete the description here. I'm just going to cut this, and we're going to use the format function. And then we're just going to pass in the temperature for our forecast. And now if we hit resume and run this in our preview, if I just zoom in, you'll see now that we only have the degrees symbol here, like so. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is we actually need to create the view that houses everything all together. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically create a view that actually has this like header at the top here, and below it, it actually has the list that we just created. So in order to build this, it's going to need to have a mixture of VStack and HStacks. So let's see how we can do that now. So let's go into our project here, and we're going to create a new view. I'm just going to call this SwiftUI view hourly forecast view. And you may be wondering why I call this hourly forecast view. Well, essentially, if you look at our simulator again, it just shows the forecast every single hour. So it's just going to basically do that for us. So what we need to do now is we need to basically define a VStack and actually build out the header for this first with a HStack. So we're going to basically embed this in a VStack first, like so, and then I'm going to embed the text in a HStack. So I'm just going to do a bit of typing and then break it down. All right, cool. So as you can see here, we basically have our HStack, which has our system image, so our SF symbol clock here. We have our hourly forecast that we uppercase, and we have our spacer that basically pushes it to left-hand side. So now what we need to do is we actually need to apply some modifiers onto this so we can actually make it look more like this. So I'm just going to do that on the HStack so all the children get the same styles. And as you can see, we can't really see our text because it's white. So on our hourly forecast view, I'm just going to give it a background for now of just like black. All right, cool. So now we can see our text and it's starting to look more like this. So now that we've done that, the next thing we need to do is underneath our HStack within our VStack, we actually need to add in the list that we just created. So underneath this, we're just going to type in like so. And as you can see, if I zoom out, you'll see now that we actually have our hourly forecast at the top, and below it, we actually have our forecast list view. And that's because we're actually adding our view within a VStack. And as you remember from before, it goes down vertically. So what we need to do is on our VStack, if you actually look at our design, we essentially have like spacing around it. And we also have a background color blue, and we have this like clip, so rounded corner radius. So what we're going to do is on our VStack, we're going to add some modifiers to basically make it look like that. So now that we can actually see this, I'm just going to remove this background I added before so I can just see it a bit better. All right, cool. So now, as you can see, we've got the padding around our list, and we've also got our background of blue, as you can see here, and we've also got our clip shape. So our rounded rectangle, I don't know if you can see it, but you can see the corner radius. If I just zoom in a bit more, you can see the corner radius is being applied onto our forecast view. If I just zoom out, as you can see here, the corner radius there. All right, sweet. So now what I want to do is I actually want to see what this would look like inside of a list. So what we're going to do is we want to add our component, hourly forecast view, into a list so we can see what it looks like. So if we just go into our content view, what I'm going to do is on our text, delete that. I'm just going to type out list. And then within our list, I'm going to add in our hourly forecast view. So let's do that now. And now we can see what our hourly forecast view looks like. And I actually want to remove these separators. So because I'm doing this in Xcode 12.5, so I'm doing this on iOS 14. iOS 15 is a much nicer way of doing this. But just for this, you have to kind of hack it. So I'm going to do this. So that will remove the edge insets, so you don't really see the separators. But because we've removed the edge insets, now what we need to do is actually add some padding, so we could actually have space around it. So on the list, I'm just going to say padding, like so, and now we have padding around it. All right, sweet. So as you can see, we've now got our component, and if I actually scroll up and down, you can see I can scroll it up and down, and I can actually scroll it horizontally to see all the hourly forecasts. So it works exactly how we want it to work. So let's just zoom in so you can see that better, and I'll just do that again. All right, cool. All right, sweet. So in this video, we basically went through VStacks, HStacks, even LazyStacks as well. And obviously we did a bit of formatting. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you gave it a thumbs up. Also as well, if you're not already, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for any updates. If you have any feedback about this video, so any comments or any suggestions for future videos, leave them in the comment section below. That's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces. And also as well, for the Euros final, England, it's coming home. Deuces.